The crystal flute felt impossibly fragile in my hand. My fingers were cold, the condensation slick. Across the room, she was laughing, a bright, brittle sound that didn't reach her eyes. The air in the opulent ballroom was thick with perfume and the low hum of forced celebration. My smile was a carefully constructed mask, plastered on so tight my jaw ached. Tonight was her 70th birthday. 70 years of cultivating an image, of weaving a narrative of grace and success, 70 years of perfecting the art of the subtle cut, the dismissive glance, the whisper that could flay you alive. I watched her hold court, surrounded by people who adored her, feared her, or owed her. The woman who had spent years trying to erase me. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me more than you know to keep sharing these stories. I remember thinking, when I first met him, that I had found the soft landing I'd always craved. My life before him had been sharp. Edges everywhere. A childhood of making do, a young adulthood of fighting for every inch of ground. Then there was him. Gentle eyes, a steady hand, a quiet confidence that felt like coming home. And his family. At first glance, they were everything I hadn't had, established, successful, a name that meant something in this city. They owned businesses, real estate, they moved in circles I'd only read about. His mother, Eleanor Vance. The matriarch. Elegant, poised, with a reputation for being as sharp in business as she was in her social life. I wanted so desperately to be accepted, to finally belong somewhere solid, somewhere safe. I brought my best self to every interaction, polished and hopeful. I listened, I learned, I offered help. I tried to fit my jagged edges into the seemingly smooth spaces of their lives. The first time I felt it was at Thanksgiving, just a few months into our dating. The family gathered at her sprawling estate. Turkeys carved with military precision, silver gleaming, conversations that felt like coded exchanges I couldn't decipher. I told a story, a funny anecdote about a mishap at work. The room went quiet. Eleanor smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That's spirited," she said, her voice a low purr. "We tend to be a little more understated here." The message was clear. My spirit was too loud, too bright, too me. Not understated enough for the Vance legacy. It was the first time I felt the chill, the deliberate exclusion, masked in polite words.
It wouldn't be the last.
I tried harder. I learned their family history, the intricate web of cousins and alliances. I studied their business, Vance Holdings, a collection of properties and ventures built by Eleanor's late husband and expanded under her formidable control. It was impressive, a pillar of the city's economy. I thought if I understood their world, if I could speak their language, maybe I could build a bridge. I brought gifts, offered help with her charity work, complimented her impeccable taste. I learned to hold my tongue, to choose my words carefully, to dim my own light just a little. But the more I tried, the more I felt her resistance. It was a constant, invisible wall. Every conversation felt like navigating a minefield. She'd ask about my family, my background, her tone dripping with faux sympathy for my less privileged beginnings. She'd praise her son, my then boyfriend, now husband, for his intelligence, his potential, always adding a subtle caveat that implied I was somehow holding him back. He saw it, of course. He loved me. He defended me gently at first. "That's just how Mom is," he'd say, a touch of weariness in his voice. "She's old school." Set in her ways, he tried to shield me, to smooth things over. But even he underestimated the depth of her disapproval, the sheer will she possessed to maintain the purity of her family line, a purity she clearly felt I contaminated. The snubs escalated. Missed invitations that were accidents, cruel jokes masked as family teasing. Introductions that highlighted my lack of pedigree. "This is my name," she'd say to her friends, a tight smile on her face. "She's with my son." Such a different background, the word different, hung in the air, heavy with judgment. I started to dread family gatherings, my stomach twisting into knots hours before we even arrived. I'd plaster on that smile, steel my nerves, and pretend the barbs didn't land. But they did. They chipped away at me, piece by piece. The business became a focal point for her attacks, though indirectly at first. My husband worked at Vance Holdings. He was good, smart, with new ideas she often dismissed or subtly undermined. She controlled the company with an iron fist, making all the major decisions, dictating the pace, clinging to old ways. I saw how it frustrated him, how his potential was stifled. He was her son, the heir, but she treated him like a junior associate who needed constant supervision. I encouraged him, told him to speak up, to push for what he believed in. This, too, became a source of her resentment. She saw me as an outside influence, poisoning her son against her, encouraging him to challenge her authority within the empire she had built. Things took a sharp turn when we got married. She made a show of accepting it, a performative display for society. But behind the scenes, the pressure intensified. She started talking more openly about the future of Vance Holdings, about her plans for succession. And her plans conspicuously minimized my husband's role, pushing him towards a side venture while positioning a distant cousin, compliant and easily controlled, for a more central position. It wasn't just about hurting me anymore. It was about strategically weakening her own son because he chose me. She saw my marriage as a betrayal of the Vance name, a deviation from her carefully laid plans, and she intended to punish him by limiting his inheritance, his influence within the company, the very thing he had worked towards his whole life. My husband was devastated. He had always believed, despite her coldness towards me, that she would ultimately do right by him, by her only child. He saw the truth then. Her control mattered more than his happiness, more than his future. It hurt him deeply. It was a betrayal from the one person whose love he should have been able to count on. Seeing him in pain, seeing the light dim in his eyes, ignited something cold and hard inside me. The desire for acceptance shriveled up and died. In its place grew a fierce, protective rage. She wasn't just hurting me anymore. She was hurting us. She was trying to destroy the life we were building together. And that was unforgivable. We started talking, really talking about what to do. Leaving the city wasn't an option. His life, his work, everything was here. Confrontation felt futile. She deflected, denied, twisted words until you questioned your own sanity. Trying to reason with her was like arguing with a brick wall built of granite and ego. The business was the source of her power, her leverage. She used it to control him, to control the narrative, to control the family. It was the heart of the Vance empire, and she reigned from its center. Then, late one night, hunched over spreadsheets and legal documents scattered across our dining table, my husband looked up, his eyes tired but alight with a new kind of fire. He had been poring over the complex ownership structure of Vance Holdings, the trusts, the different subsidiaries. His father had been a shrewd businessman, and while Eleanor had consolidated power after his death, there were intricate layers, forgotten clauses, minority stakeholders who had been sidelined over the years. The company wasn't a simple, wholly owned entity under her direct name. It was a labyrinth. There are options, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Small ones. Loopholes. People who aren't happy with her management. We spent months working in secret. Late nights became the norm. We consulted lawyers, financial advisors, people who knew the inner workings of the city's old money, people who knew Eleanor Vance, and perhaps harbored their own resentments. It was a crash course in corporate law, in hostile takeovers disguised as friendly acquisitions, in leveraging assets and securing funding without raising a single red flag that could get back to her. We had to be invisible. We had to be silent. Every step was a risk. Every conversation felt like a potential leak. We spoke in code, sometimes even in our own home. The house, once a place of quiet comfort, became our war room, filled with the tension of strategy and the fear of discovery. She, meanwhile, was oblivious, or perhaps too consumed with her own machinations to notice. She continued her subtle campaign of psychological warfare. She'd call my husband, ostensibly for business, but weave in comments about my suitability, my class, my origins. She'd make grand pronouncements about the future of Vance Holdings at family dinners, sketching out a vision where my husband was politely sidelined. She was building her own narrative, solidifying her power, confident that her control was absolute, her position unassailable. She believed we were powerless against her, small insects she could simply brush aside. This absolute certainty was her blind spot. She never once considered that we might not just weather the storm she created, but that we might learn to control the weather itself. The plan was audacious. It involved acquiring shares from disgruntled distant relatives, leveraging our own savings, securing loans from banks who saw the potential she was stifling, and, most importantly, identifying a specific, complex subsidiary she had neglected, one that held a surprising amount of underlying value and, crucially, had a slightly different ownership structure that allowed for a strategic entry point. It wasn't about buying the whole company overnight. It was about buying a controlling stake in a pivotal piece, a piece that gave us unexpected leverage over the rest of the structure, a piece that the initial legal framework, drafted decades ago, had left surprisingly open to outside acquisition under specific conditions. Conditions we painstakingly worked to meet. There were moments of sheer panic. Deals that nearly fell through. Loans that seemed impossible to secure. Days when the weight of the secret felt crushing, when the fear of failure, of losing everything we had worked for, including our own financial stability, was overwhelming. But every time I saw the quiet pain in my husband's eyes when his mother undermined him, every time I remembered her cold dismissiveness, the resolve hardened. We were fighting for our life together, for his right to his own future, for my right to simply exist without being chipped away by her cruelty. This wasn't just business, it was survival. It was reclaiming dignity. We closed the final pieces of the deal 2 days before her birthday. It was quiet, anticlimactic almost. Just papers signed in a lawyer's office, wire transfers confirmed. After months of frantic, clandestine work, it ended with a few clicks and the dry rustle of documents. But the feeling wasn't anticlimactic. It was a coiled spring, ready to snap. It was the calm before the storm we were about to unleash. We kept it a secret, even from our closest friends, even from the rest of the family. The birthday party, the 70 years of carefully constructed facade, felt like the perfect stage. The height of her power, the center of her world, surrounded by the people whose opinions she valued above all else. It was time to show her the reality she had refused to see. The birthday party. It felt surreal walking in, knowing what we knew, carrying the weight of the secret that was about to detonate in the middle of her perfect celebration. The air was thick with false smiles and polite conversation. She was radiant, dressed in a gown that sparkled like ice, her hair perfectly coiffed, her jewelry catching the light. People flocked to her, offering congratulations, compliments that she accepted with practiced grace. I stood by my husband's side, my own smile feeling more like a grimace now. I watched her, this woman who had tried to diminish me, to erase me, to hurt the man I loved. The champagne flute was still cold in my hand. The speeches began. Her children spoke, her friends, her business associates, all praising her legacy, her strength, her vision. I listened, my heart pounding a heavy, irregular rhythm against my ribs. The tension in the room, for me at least, was suffocating. My husband stood tall beside me, his hand finding mine, squeezing gently. He was ready. We were ready. Eleanor took the microphone. She spoke eloquently, thanking everyone for coming, reflecting on her life, her family, the importance of legacy. She glanced at me then, her eyes lingering for just a fraction of a second too long. Her smile tightened, the mask slipping just enough for the coldness to show. She spoke about the future of Vance Holdings, about passing the torch, about ensuring the company remained in safe, capable hands that understood its history, its values. It was a subtle, public reaffirmation of her plan to sideline my husband, a final twist of the knife before her grand finale. The air felt thinner, harder to breathe. As she finished her speech, people began to applaud. She stepped down from the small stage, and as she moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations, she paused near our table. She leaned in, her smile still painted on for the onlookers, but her eyes were locked on mine, glittering with malice. Her voice dropped to a low, venomous whisper, meant only for me. "You'll never be part of this family," she breathed, the words a sharp shard of ice directly to my heart. "You don't belong here. You never will." The air left my lungs. Years of trying, of hoping, of enduring the cuts and the slights, culminating in this raw, brutal confession of her true feelings, delivered at the height of her triumph. For a split second, the old pain flared, sharp and familiar. Then something shifted. The pain solidified into something else. Something cold. Something powerful. I didn't flinch. I met her gaze, holding it steadily. Before I could even formulate a response, before the ice in her eyes could freeze me completely, my husband stepped forward. He hadn't been standing right beside me, but he was close enough to have heard her, close enough to see the micro-expression of cruelty on his mother's face. He cleared his throat, a sound that cut through the polite murmur of conversation that had resumed. People turned towards him, expecting perhaps a toast to his mother, a dutiful son's praise. He raised his glass, not towards his mother, but towards the room. His voice was clear, steady, amplified slightly by the sudden hush that fell over the nearest tables. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces. "My mother spoke beautifully about the future of Vance Holdings, and it's in that spirit that I have an announcement." He paused for just a beat, his eyes finding his mother's. Her smile was still fixed, but a flicker of confusion crossed her face. "As of this morning," he continued, his voice gaining strength, "my wife and I, through our new holding company, have completed the acquisition of a controlling interest in Vance Properties Incorporated." He named the specific subsidiary, the one she had deemed insignificant enough to neglect, the one with the loophole, the seemingly minor piece that was, in fact, the linchpin. The silence that followed wasn't just a hush. It was a complete, absolute vacuum. Sound ceased to exist. Every eye in the room was on him. Then, slowly, they shifted to Eleanor Vance. Her face, seconds before radiant with triumphant cruelty, drained of all color. The carefully applied makeup suddenly stood out starkly against her ashen skin. Her eyes, moments ago sharp and malicious towards me, widened in disbelief, then narrowed in shock and dawning horror. Her mouth, still curved in that fixed smile, trembled. The champagne flute slipped from her fingers, hitting the plush carpet with a muffled thud that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. She wasn't just pale. She was ghost white, blindsided. The woman who had orchestrated every detail, controlled every outcome, manipulated every person in her orbit, had never, in her wildest nightmares, imagined this. She had been so focused on her subtle poisoning, on weakening her son, and excluding me, that she had missed the quiet work happening beneath the surface, the careful dismantling of the very foundation of her power. She had been playing a game of social snubs and corporate maneuvers, but we had been playing a game of ownership. And we had just taken the board. The silence held, heavy and thick. People exchanged stunned glances. Whispers started, growing quickly into a murmur of disbelief and speculation. I stood straighter, the fragile champagne flute forgotten in my hand. I looked at Eleanor Vance, her face a mask of shock and utter defeat. She had tried to break me with words, to dismiss me as irrelevant. But words were just air. Ownership was power. And we had just taken hers. The satisfaction was cold, clean, absolute. It wasn't the fiery, chaotic revenge I might have once imagined. It was the quiet, devastating victory of strategy over cruelty, of patience over ego. She had built her empire on control and dismissed us as minor players. We had just shown her that sometimes the quietest players are the ones with the sharpest moves. The party devolved quickly after that. The polite facade shattered. The air crackled with tension and speculation. Some people rushed to Eleanor's side, murmuring anxiously. Others gravitated towards us, a mix of shock, curiosity, and a few guarded smiles that spoke of old grievances with the matriarch. Family members looked bewildered, caught in the crossfire of a war they hadn't known was being fought. Eleanor herself was speechless, her eyes darting from my husband to me, still frozen in that moment of pure, unadulterated shock. Her reign, symbolized by this lavish party, had just been irrevocably challenged, possibly ended, with a few calm sentences. Leaving the ballroom felt like walking out of a battlefield. The tension followed us into the car, but it was different now. It wasn't the tension of dread, but the vibrating energy of action taken, of a line drawn. My husband took my hand again, lacing our fingers together. We didn't speak much on the drive home. There was too much to process, too much adrenaline still coursing through our veins. The quiet drive was filled with unspoken understanding, the shared weight of the secret lifted, replaced by the exhilarating, terrifying reality of what we had done. Back in our quiet home, the silence felt different again. Not a war room anymore, but a sanctuary. We sat together, the documents spread out on the table once more, but this time they represented not a daunting goal, but a hard-won victory. The legal complexities, the financial risks, the months of secrecy, it all coalesced into this single, undeniable fact. We owned a significant piece of her empire. A piece large enough to shift the balance of power, to give us a seat at the table, a voice she could no longer ignore or silence. The emotional weight of it settled over me gradually. It wasn't pure triumph. There was a strange melancholy mixed in. The years of wanting to belong, the deep ache of exclusion. The victory didn't erase those feelings entirely. It was vindication. Yes, a powerful reclaiming of my own worth in the face of her dismissal. But it also felt like the final nail in the coffin of any hope for genuine family connection with his side. The battle was over, in a sense, but the family was irrevocably fractured. The cost of belonging, it turned out, was sometimes too high, and the alternative, independence, came at the price of burning bridges. In the days and weeks that followed, the fallout was immense. The city buzzed with the news. Board meetings were tense affairs. Eleanor fought back, of course. She threatened, she maneuvered, she tried to leverage her remaining power and influence. But our position was legally sound. We had done our homework. We held the shares, the contracts, the undeniable proof of ownership. The tables had turned, and she was the one reacting, scrambling to understand how our carefully constructed world had been so quietly undermined. My husband, no longer the stifled heir, stepped into his power, using his deep understanding of the business, coupled with my strategic thinking and the leverage we now held, to begin implementing the changes he had long envisioned. It wasn't about destroying her, it was about building something different, something healthier, something that reflected our values, not just hers. Our relationship, tested by the secrecy and the immense pressure, came out stronger. We had faced a formidable opponent together, relied on each other completely, and emerged victorious. He saw me not just as his wife, but as a partner, a strategist, a force to be reckoned with. And I saw him as the strong, capable man I always knew he was, finally unshackled from his mother's limiting expectations. Eleanor Vance never truly accepted it.
How could she?
Her entire identity was tied to her control, her image of the perfect family, the perfect legacy. We were the inconvenient truth, the disruption she couldn't smooth over or dismiss. Our interactions became purely transactional, conducted through lawyers or brief, frosty exchanges at necessary family functions, which became increasingly rare. The family, once a source of hoped-for belonging, became a landscape marked by the battle lines we had drawn. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that moment at her birthday party. The sound of her whisper, the venom in her eyes. "You'll never be part of this family," and then her face, pure white with shock as my husband announced that we had just bought a significant piece of the family legacy she tried to keep me out of. The irony isn't lost on me. She wanted to exclude me, to deny my place, only to lose her own hold on the very thing she used to define her family's importance. We didn't just become part of the family business. We became a force that reshaped it, fundamentally changing the family dynamic forever. It wasn't the belonging I had initially sought, the warm embrace of acceptance. It was something colder, harder, perhaps more real. A place earned not through permission, but through power. A family redefined, not by blood or by her decree, but by the alliances forged in the quiet hours before the storm, by the courage to fight for your own corner, and by the cold, sharp satisfaction of turning the tables on someone who thought they held all the cards. If this story hit close to home, if you've ever had to fight for your place, not just at a table, but in a life someone else tried to exclude you from, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these stories to life.